I'll see you guys in the dark.
Hey, Stalkers of the Night. You guys should go check out my Patreon. The link will be in the description down below. There's a few tier rewards, some of them ranging from $1 and up. Go check it out if you want to help me support this channel and help it grow and make it even better than it was before.
When I was 20 years old, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shifts. But when the guy who delivered for the late night shift ended up getting fired due to him losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an asshole and essentially told me that if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I was fired as well. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked that shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punch it in on my GPS, and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive, and it's about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses. But the house I delivered to was a duplex. I rang the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I'm standing there getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down. But thankfully, a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here, and he just stands there staring at me. I asked if he was okay, and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine, sorry. I got off work not too long ago, and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza, and as I'm taking the change, he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said goodnight, and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I got a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time and rang the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and says, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and can't wait to go home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know the feeling pretty well." As he was pulling out his wallet, as he's counting his money, he asked me what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly told him my name. As I'm making change, he asked me if he could have my number, as he'd love to hang out with somebody as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positively he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way too young. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15, and I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay, I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway, staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy, and even brought it up to my coworkers, and they agreed it was pretty creepy. Except for the boss, who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. Fucking asshole. A week later, as I'm working the night shift, and we get the order from the same guy again, and this is when the shit really hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30 p.m., and keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it doesn't look like a single light is on in the house. I got out of my car, and I walked to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man, except this time he was wearing a suit, and I jumped back a little. He laughs and said, "I'm sorry if I scared you. I saw you out the window, and I figured I would just open the door now so that you wouldn't have to ring my doorbell." I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house. So was he sitting in the dark this whole time? And if so, why? I nervously laughed and said it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said, yes, I do. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" What? The fuck? I once again told him I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets closer to me, and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it onto the side and grabs me by my arms really hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him, "Dude, please. I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I've ever seen on someone's face and says, "I really don't care. Get inside now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into the house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something to this day that I am still thankful that worked. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in the stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds, and he loosens his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in, he runs at me and tries pulling me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm, and even yells, "Why are you making this so freaking difficult?" I grab a half-empty soda bottle I had in the cup holder and throw it at him, and luckily it hits his head, and he lets me go. I slam the door, and then all of a sudden, he jumps right back on the hood of my car, starts scratching and banging on the windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse, and quickly back out of the spot, and quickly reverse down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood, screaming, "Stop the freaking car!" I turned on into the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily he falls off the hood of my car. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as I could. In my panic state, I drove a couple blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto another side block as I feared I was being followed. Eventually I reached a red light and slammed on the brakes and just sat at the intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, I pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I particularly broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker confronted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrived at the store, and I gave them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself, as well as any scratches on my car from the encounter of evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed, and strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily, a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later I received an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly at first for robberies and assaults, but later on, it was for sexual crimes. He had been released from jail about 5 months before this encounter for having it with a minor. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone, and his family had no idea where he ran off to, but the police insisted they would find him. And indeed, they did, but not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind, but the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently he fled to another city nearby, and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking along late at night on a street. Luckily, someone happened to be looking out the window at the time, called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee, and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard, and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to his own wounds, long before the ambulance even arrived. I thank the officers for everything they did, and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walked down the street, and I light up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on anyone, but after hearing about this, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he wouldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him ever again, and that I wouldn't have to go through this with charging him and reliving what happened every night. My last experience 2 years ago before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I am alone and face to face with the psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me into his house. I was 16 years old and just got my license, so I needed a job to pay for my car. A few of my friends were working at a local pizza place in town close to my house, so I decided to apply and got the job without having to interview because they were so short-staffed. They also hired me as a delivery driver without ever checking to see if I had a driver's license or not. About a month or two later, we were having a really busy night, and I was sent off to a delivery in a fairly nice part of town the next city over. This was before GPS was common and not very reliable, so we still used maps to locate houses. This particular house wasn't a new development, so it wasn't listed in any of our directories, but the boss thought he knew where it was and gave me directions. He was way off, so I had to call the house for directions, and this is where things got really weird. The conversation on the phone was normal. I told the man I was near his house, but needed directions because the ones I was given weren't accurate. He was very understanding and told me how to get there from the road I was on. A few minutes later, I pull into his driveway and instantly get a bad feeling. He was a man in his early 50s to 60s and was standing in the middle of his driveway with a creepy, satisfied smile on his face and wearing a maroon silk bathrobe. I got out of the car and gave him his 10-inch Hawaiian pizza, which costed $10.95 at the time. He gave me a $20 bill and told me to keep the change. Considering I was late on the delivery and had to call the customer for directions, I wasn't expecting anything for a tip, let alone almost $10. I drove away from the delivery thinking that something was off, but I got a great tip, so I was happy. I lit up a smoke and turned up my radio when I felt my phone vibrate. It was the number from the house I was just at. I got nervous thinking it was about to be a complaint or something, because why else would someone call the delivery guy after he was delivering your food? My blood curdled at the words that came out of his mouth. "Do you want me to come back over and get the knife?" he said. Or at least that is what I heard. I said something and hung up the phone and drove back to work as fast as I could. I also called one of my friends who was working there at the time and told him what had happened. On the 5-minute ride back to work, he called me at least 3 or 4 more times. For some reason, I actually answered the phone on one of those calls, and he asked me if I wanted to come back after I got off work and spend the night. I was greeted at work by laughter from pretty much everyone working that night. Everyone thought I was either faking or overreacting it. Then I got another call on my phone from the same guy. I showed my manager while the phone was ringing, and I let it go to voicemail. That's when he decided to call the restaurant. Once this happened, my manager realized this was probably a serious situation and answered the phone pretending to be me. He had a very short conversation with the guy, and at the end told him he is not allowed to do business with us anymore, and we are blocking his number from now on. When my boss hung up the phone, his face was pure white and looked like he could barely comprehend what had just happened. I asked what the guy said, but the boss would not repeat the words that came out of his mouth. I was so paranoid that I had to stay with my friend that night instead of going home. Guess who called me a couple hours later? Yeah, he called at least 10 times. for at least a week or two. I was living in fear of being kidnapped at this point. I was always looking at people or cars that were around me, being paranoid that I was being watched or even followed. It's possible that I was right because I started getting phone calls again. This is when I decided it was time to call the cops and put an end to this once and for all. I explained everything to the officer, and he assured me that he would take care of the situation. Turns out the cops did nothing. I live in a low crime town of less than 20,000 people. This guy didn't have anything else to do that day except write some speeding tickets during the afternoon, some DUIs in the evening. The calls kept coming in, and my paranoia just grew. This needed to stop, so I told my boss that things hadn't improved, and he called the cops himself. An officer came down to the restaurant and took down our statements. Unlike the other officer, this man seemed visibly shaken and angered by the events that had just happened. He promised me that he would personally handle the situation, and I didn't have to worry anymore. This police officer followed up on what he said, and I never heard from that creep ever again. I kept that same job for about 3 years, and had nothing but great times there. However, creepy silk bathrobe fuckface, go screw yourself, and let's not meet ever again. This happened back when I was 17 and living in a small rural village. I had been at a friend's all evening watching films and chilling, and I left to go home around 11 p.m. It was quite a long walk back to mine, as she lived on the outskirts of the village down from some roads. I felt relatively safe, as when it got to a certain time of night it was quiet. You wouldn't bump into anybody, and there would hardly be any cars on the road, especially at that late hour. It was weirdly peaceful. Where I lived was a large avenue with 2 big blocks of houses, like 2 big circles that you could get to after following a small dark road that consisted of a few large old houses and a vicarage. As I am passing the vicarage, I see this little beat-up red Nissan coming towards me. The closer it gets, the more it slows down, and the guy is nearly breaking his neck trying to look at me. I mean, there was nothing subtle about it. It nearly came to a full stop as it drew alongside me, and I started to panic. There was not another soul about, just me and this strange guy. I was determined not to get myself in a tiz, so I picked up the pace and refused to look at him. As far as I know, he drove off. I continued walking home, which was literally a 5-minute straight line from there, and I kept listening out for a car engine, and was vigilant of any headlights creeping up behind me. I heard nothing and saw nothing, so I breathed a sigh of relief as I could now see my house. I walked in and locked the door and saw my mom stood in the living room chatting on the phone. I'm trying to interrupt her conversation, telling her about the weird guy in the red car, when for some reason she goes to the front window and peeks through the curtains, and she takes the phone from her ear and says, "What car?" This is all in a minute since walking through the door, and I'm thinking to myself, it can't be him, because if he had followed me, I would have heard the engine. Before I even get a chance to look for myself, there is a knock at the front door. So I go and answer it, only pulling it open a few inches, and there is this guy, stood there empty-handed wearing what looked like a baseball cap. It was the same guy, the same car. I'm just like, what the hell? I say, "I can help you." "Did you order pizza?" he asked me. And I'm like, "No, I think you have the wrong house." Taking a step towards me, he says again in a not freaking around kind of tone, "No," I said, "did you order a pizza?" Before I reply, my mom has come up behind me, opened the door fully, and says, "Is there a problem?" This causes him to back up, mumbling, "I must have the wrong address," before he gets in his car and just takes off. Sure to say, we both were a bit spooked and made sure everywhere was locked up properly. So, to the stealthy alleged pizza guy who stalked me home, let's not meet again, please. So my sister and I decided to order pizza tonight, and we used the Domino's app that my sister has on her phone. She went to pick up her boyfriend while the pizza was going to be delivered, and I was just to get it once it was delivered and pay the guy. About 10 minutes later, I'm on my laptop doing homework, and behold, the doorbell rings. I get up and go to the door, pay for the pizza, and set it on the counter. I go back to working on my homework I had for my professor tomorrow morning. Later that evening, I was having a bath. I finished up and started to dry my hair when my sister knocked on the door and asked to talk to me for a moment. I put on my new pajamas and go down to her room once my hair was dry, and I asked her what's up. She showed me a text that the pizza guy delivery boy sent her. It read, "Hey, I delivered your pizza. Just wanted to say you looked really cute, and I wish we could have chatted more." Now, you may not understand why this is creepy on my end, but this guy went out of his way to get the phone number of somebody he delivered pizza to from the app order and send them a text without the go from the person he was texting. He thought my sister, who ordered the pizza, was me. I stand at about 4'7", and I have a baby face. Yes, I am 18, but I still look like a child to people who don't know that. This guy who delivered the pizza was nearly an entire foot taller than me and looked to be about mid to late 20s. I told my sister to put the text message up on Reddit when she had the chance, so soon you'll see the text message to prove this altercation took place. But yeah, that was really creepy on my end. I just wanted some pizza, man, not looking for a porno-style hookup. So, creepy pizza delivery guy, let's not meet ever again. This was years ago when I was 16 or 17. I'm 32 now, and was recently talking to someone about this, and how in retrospect it was a pretty creepy experience. I grew up in a small town, a ways outside of San Diego. My parents let me get a job at this pizza place because a couple friends had also worked there, and our town was generally viewed as safe. The pizza place had no real adhering to laws about what one should wear in a kitchen restaurant environment, and since it was actually 100+ degrees during the summer, I often just wore tank tops and skirts. I delivered an order to an apartment in the middle of town above a business that was perpetually closed, and the guy was probably in his early to mid-30s. I remember thinking at first he was kind of attractive in an older guy type of way. He asked me to bring the order inside so he can get the cash, and I did. Again, in retrospect, I'm like, that was so dumb. I went into his apartment. I remember he was kind of looking at me like he was eating me with his eyes. He asked me a few questions about myself, then poured 2 shots of whiskey, and my dumbass was like, "Oh, cool, thanks." I did the shot with him. Then he started pressuring me for my phone number, asking when I get off, etc. I told him I have a boyfriend when he asked for my number, but he was persistent and really wanted me to come over after I got off work. He also kept being really pushy, asking if my hair was naturally red, looking me up and down, etc. He was asking what time I get off, telling me he'd come pick me up. I eventually left and went back to work thinking, that was kind of weird. Nothing ever came of it, but I always got a sort of sinking in my pit of the stomach feel whenever I drove by that apartment. I had told my manager that he was trying to get my number and come over after work so he wouldn't let the shop take orders from that guy ever again. I think about how dumb I was to go into that apartment first of all, then take a shot of whiskey with him, and then I thank goodness that I wasn't stupid enough to go there after work or something.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night, and I'll see you next time.